Why narcissists never recover after betraying the wrong person is a story of psychological inevitability, not moral failing. They never imagined that the act of betrayal would mark the point where their life ceased evolving. This is not about karma, nor about revenge, nor about a poetic justice delivered from outside forces. It is about the collapse of a psyche that refuses to confront itself. As Carl Jung explained, the refusal to face the unconscious, the aspects of the self we deny or suppress, creates an internal pressure that eventually implodes. Betraying you is not simply a tactical error. It is the beginning of an irreversible internal fracture, one that quietly eliminates the possibility of true growth or wholeness in their life. The story begins not with your actions, but with the architecture of the narcissist's mind. From a Jungian perspective, their betrayal is never accidental. It is not a random lapse of morality or an impulsive mistake. It is a structural inevitability embedded in the very framework of a fragmented psyche. Surface-level explanations, selfishness, fear of commitment, or even malicious intent fail to capture the truth. The narcissist's mind lacks a cohesive inner center, a core self that integrates experience, emotion, and identity. Instead, the psyche is artificially constructed around the persona, a rigid social mask designed not merely for interaction but for survival. This mask is their reality, not a temporary facade. Jung described the persona as a compromise between individual identity and societal expectation. In healthy minds, it mediates, protecting the ego while allowing authentic self-expression. In narcissism, the compromise becomes pathological. The mask no longer mediates the ego, it replaces it entirely. The narcissist cannot distinguish between the mask and the self. Their existence becomes externally sourced, conditional upon admiration, attention, and control. Every interaction, every relationship is filtered through the persona, which functions as a fragile buffer against the chaos of an unintegrated psyche. You entered this world not as a partner or friend, but as a stabilizing psychic function, a mirror of coherence that temporarily filled an internal void. Your presence represents something the narcissist cannot access within themselves: inner continuity, stability, and a latent connection to the self. Jung would call this an unconscious recognition of the self in the other, a phenomenon both illuminating and threatening. The narcissist, unable to relate consciously to their own inner life, experiences your wholeness as an external object to control or absorb. At first, this manifests as idealization. You are elevated, almost venerated, not because of your intrinsic qualities alone, but because your presence temporarily stabilizes the narcissist's collapsing inner world. Your groundedness becomes a lifeline for a psyche unable to maintain coherence internally, which is why they initially treat you with awe and dependency. The turning point comes when you begin to individuate, when your identity and autonomy emerge beyond their control. Individuation, in Jungian terms, is the process of integrating unconscious content and becoming psychologically whole. When you assert boundaries, act consistently, or refuse to serve as a passive mirror, the narcissist experiences catastrophic psychic shock. Your stability illuminates their fragmentation. Your consistency reveals the absence of an inner self, and this recognition triggers a state of annihilation anxiety, though unconsciously. Their ego, already fragile and dependent on external validation, senses the cracks in the persona. At this moment, the shadow emerges, the repository of all rejected, denied, or unacknowledged aspects of the self, including envy, rage, dependency, and shame. In a healthy psyche, the shadow is gradually integrated into consciousness, allowing growth and self-awareness. In narcissism, the shadow cannot be tolerated. Exposure threatens collapse. The mind, unable to assimilate uncomfortable truths, resorts to projection. All intolerable internal content is expelled outward and attributed to you. Suddenly, you become selfish, manipulative, or disloyal, not because these traits truly define you, but because they represent the unmanageable aspects of their own personality. This projection is not deliberate deception. It is a psychological defensive hallucination, a necessary illusion that allows the narcissist to preserve the fragile integrity of the false self. Betrayal is the behavioral expression of this psychic defense, not merely a personal attack. By betraying you, the narcissist symbolically eliminates the mirror that reflects their inner insufficiency. Jung emphasized that when the shadow is unassimilated, it acts autonomously, often with destructive consequences. The narcissist does not consciously choose betrayal. They feel compelled, driven by the autonomous force of unprocessed psychic content. You, with your coherence and autonomy, become intolerable. The truth you carry, psychological reality they cannot confront, is threatening. The act of betrayal is therefore not about desire for someone else, nor is it about superficial satisfaction. The third party is incidental. What truly matters is the psychic function they perform, a mirror that can be idealized without exposing the inner void. Betrayal is an escape route from self-awareness. It allows the narcissist to avoid the terror of individuation, to bypass the inner confrontation that would otherwise force psychic collapse. Jung warned that resisting individuation turns life itself into a destructive force, and this is precisely what occurs. The narcissist chooses external destruction to preserve internal illusion. Their libido, or psychic energy, is almost entirely externalized. In a healthy psyche, libido circulates inward and outward, allowing reflection, creativity, and emotional balance. In narcissism, it flows exclusively outward, invested in attention, admiration, and the emotional responses of others, leaving the self starved, fragmented, and incapable of true recovery. When you withdraw emotionally, stabilize internally, or refuse to participate in their manipulative dramas, you are, in essence, starving the narcissistic system that feeds on external validation. The narcissist experiences this loss of psychic energy, or libido, as an existential panic, an internal alarm signaling collapse. Their subsequent betrayal is rarely motivated by pleasure or desire. It is a desperate, almost frantic attempt to restore energetic equilibrium. They attack not to gain something tangible, but to reclaim the illusion of control and self-cohesion. Ironically, this is why those who are most psychologically intact, most grounded and autonomous, become the very people they choose to betray. Your wholeness threatens the fragile balance they have constructed. Jung noted that encounters with the self, whether one's own or reflected in another, can be profoundly overwhelming. For the narcissist, you unconsciously symbolize an integrated self they have never experienced internally. Your very presence acts as a mirror, exposing the absence they cannot tolerate. Betrayal, therefore, is not a rejection of you personally. It is a rejection of the parts of themselves they refuse to face. This process operates entirely unconsciously. Any attempt to rationalize, seek closure, or demand an explanation is doomed. Their capacity for introspection is limited by the fragility of their ego. Narratives constructed post-betrayal serve only to preserve their illusory self, masking the collapse beneath. The impact of this betrayal often feels abrupt, disproportionate, and shocking. From your perspective, you may have been operating authentically, investing in reciprocity, trust, and presence. The narcissist, however, operates instrumentally, relating to you as a function or resource rather than a human being with autonomous depth. Once you cease to serve their psychic needs, the mirror must shatter. This is not malice for malice's sake. It is the tragic consequence of a psyche lacking an inner home. Jungian depth psychology frames tragedy not as moral failing, but as unconsciousness enacted. The narcissist's betrayal is a tragedy that seals their potential for growth, ensuring stagnation and psychic disintegration. Betrayal, therefore, is less about your worthiness or replaceability and more about the psychic conflict you activate. You embody the potential for individuation, the very process that would force them to confront their shadow. Unable to tolerate this exposure, the narcissist opts for destruction outward rather than self-integration inward. Misjudgment compounds the harm. The narcissist believes they understand you, yet their perception is distorted by projection, ego inflation, and a structural inability to recognize depth. They interpret your autonomy, calm, and reflective presence as compliance, availability, or passivity, not as indicators of internal strength. This fatal misreading lays the groundwork for their catastrophic decision to betray. Projection operates as a fundamental lens in the narcissist's perception. They do not see you as a person, but as a placeholder for unresolved inner content. Your loyalty, introspection, and emotional intelligence are misread as dependence or malleability. The narcissist assumes that your inner coherence must rely upon them, that your attachment is contingent on their presence. Jung described this as unconscious identification, a psychic distortion whereby they equate your strengths with weaknesses or needs within themselves. This mechanism allows them to maintain superiority while justifying abandonment. They rationalize betrayal as an act of control, failing to recognize that the actual trajectory of transformation belongs to you, not them. The narcissist's incapacity to perceive the self in another stems from their own incomplete individuation. In Jungian theory, recognizing the self in others requires prior awareness of the self within oneself. Because the narcissist has not integrated their shadow or developed a cohesive inner identity, they cannot recognize wholeness in another human being. When they encounter someone closer to integration, they perceive not strength, but detachment, not autonomy, but insufficiency. Your stability, presence, and groundedness are misinterpreted as weakness or compliance. This fundamental misunderstanding sets the stage for the fatal miscalculation, believing that betrayal diminishes you, when in truth it reveals their own fragility and inability to sustain inner coherence. Ego inflation compounds this error. The narcissist equates loudness, dominance, and emotional volatility with power, mistaking external visibility for internal strength. In contrast, restraint, reflection, and subtlety are perceived as vulnerability. Because your strength is internally sourced, subtle, and self-contained, it remains invisible to them. They project their own dependency onto you, assuming that your stability relies upon their attention, that your presence is conditional. This leads to reckless overconfidence during betrayal. They act under the illusion that you will orbit their absence, desperate for validation or closure, completely unaware that your trajectory is moving independently. Their perceived victory is, in reality, the first step toward their own stagnation. Finally, the narcissist misjudges the temporal dimension of your experience. Their psychic orientation is toward immediacy, instant validation, rapid narrative control, and the illusion of swift dominance. They assume that whoever reacts first is strongest. That speed of emotional manipulation dictates power. You, in contrast, respond with containment and deliberate reflection. Pain, withdrawal, and internal stabilization are not collapse. They are the mechanisms through which your ego reorganizes, integrates, and strengthens. Jung emphasized that crises catalyze individuation. The rupture caused by betrayal does not weaken you. It exposes unconscious material for integration. Whereas they flee destruction outward, you undergo transformation inward. Jungian psychology operates on a temporal axis that the narcissist cannot comprehend. Integration is slow. Meaning unfolds gradually, often imperceptibly. What the narcissist interprets as stagnation or passivity is, in fact, incubation. Your silence, your calm, and your withdrawal from external dramas are not signs of weakness. They are the processes by which your inner psyche strengthens and reorganizes. By contrast, the narcissist expects immediate reactions, instant collapse, or visible dependency. When their predictions fail, when decay does not follow, their internal logic falters. They are left bewildered because they equate movement with life. Your stillness is transformative, but in their mind, it is threatening, unintelligible, and impossible to control. This incubation marks the beginning of your liberation and their undoing. Projection becomes a decisive mechanism in the aftermath of betrayal. The narcissist constructs narratives in which you appear bitter, obsessed, or psychologically unstable. These stories are less about your reality and more about their compulsion to externalize guilt. Jung noted that when guilt cannot be consciously metabolized, it is projected outward as blame. By insisting that you are suffering more than you are, they shield themselves from confronting their own emptiness. Your resilience and autonomy shatter their constructed fantasy that they are the source of your vitality. This projection is simultaneously protective and self-defeating. They preserve their false self at the expense of remaining tethered to illusions that cannot withstand scrutiny. Even after leaving, narcissists often return psychologically, if not physically. They monitor, inquire, triangulate, or provoke reactions long after betrayal, not seeking reconciliation, but confirmation. Their obsessive need is to verify that they still occupy space in your psyche, that your attention remains externally sourced, tethered to them. When they discover that you have withdrawn, internally stabilized, and redirected your energy inward, they misinterpret your autonomy as performance. They cannot imagine genuine detachment because their psyche has never experienced it. Jung described this as the inability to withdraw projections. They are trapped in an external economy of mirrors, scanning endlessly for reflections of value. Your absence disorients them, producing oscillations of dismissal and obsession. At the deepest level, the narcissists misjudged you because they mistook humanity for predictability. They believed that by mapping your behavior, they understood your psyche. Jung warned that the psyche is symbolic, not mechanical. Humans respond from evolving inner centers, not predictable scripts. Your responses, grounded in self-integration, were unknowable to someone who only interprets surfaces. Ironically, they equated emotional detachment with strength, failing to recognize that numbness is a defense against inner collapse, not a measure of power. You, capable of deep feeling without losing yourself, embodied a form of resilience and autonomy entirely foreign to them. Betrayal became their attempt to control what could not be controlled, but in doing so, they triggered forces beyond their comprehension. Part 3 marks the point at which betrayal becomes a psychological death sentence for the narcissist: shadow backlash and libido collapse. From a Jungian perspective, the visible acts of leaving, devaluing, or replacing are only surface movements. The true consequences occur internally, invisibly, and irreversibly. The narcissist triggers a backlash from the shadow, a psychic force they cannot metabolize. What appears externally as relief or triumph is, internally, the beginning of disintegration. Betrayal removes the final, stabilizing object, you, whose presence had maintained fragile equilibrium between ego, persona, and shadow. Without this stabilizer, the already precarious structure of their psyche begins to collapse under its own unresolved projected contents. Before betrayal, the narcissist survives by outsourcing regulation to external mirrors. You were not simply a partner or friend, you were a psychic regulator. Your attention absorbed their projections, contained their emptiness, and stabilized the fragile ego. Jung would describe this as a parasitic arrangement of libido, wherein psychic energy that should circulate inward is siphoned outward and attached to another. Functionally, it maintained the structure, but it was unstable, akin to a building supported by external beams. Betrayal removes those beams. The narcissist believes they are liberating themselves from inconvenience, but in reality, they amputate the last conduit through which psychic energy flowed, initiating the collapse of internal coherence that cannot be externally compensated. Libido collapse is central to this psychological implosion. In Jungian theory, libido encompasses not just desire, but the vital force of meaning, motivation, and creativity. When the narcissist severs the connection with their final stabilizing mirror, this psychic energy rapidly dissipates. Depression, agitation, emptiness, and a profound sense of deadness ensue. Initially, they may not perceive the loss because they rush to replace the external object. Another person, another source of validation. Replacement, however, does not restore equilibrium. It merely delays the inevitable collapse. The shadow, long repressed and projected onto you, loses its container, floods the ego, and exposes the fragility that was always latent, now amplified by betrayal. The shadow backlash is catastrophic because all the rejected elements, shame, envy, rage, inferiority, return simultaneously without mediation. Jung warned that abrupt withdrawal of projections overwhelms the psyche. For the narcissist, this is not insight, but chaos. Restlessness, insomnia, irritability, and emotional flattening intensify. The psyche begins cannibalizing itself. To compensate, the ego inflates outward, manifesting as hyperactivity, grandiosity, recklessness, or euphoric behavior. Jung termed this compensatory inflation, an overextension of the persona to counterbalance internal voids. The narcissist appears larger, louder, more extreme, yet this is a desperate overcorrection. The collapse is now inevitable. Every external display masks an internal implosion, a system destabilized from within. The higher the persona is inflated, the more violently the shadow reacts. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not merely a symbolic concept, it possesses autonomy when denied integration. Jung observed that unconscious contents, if ignored, begin to act like autonomous complexes. In the narcissist, this manifests as sudden mood swings, irrational paranoia, intrusive thoughts, and chronic misinterpretation of neutral events as threats. They become hyper-focused on comparison, dominance, and imagined slights, all while believing they are exercising control. This is not psychological growth, it is regression locked in place by betrayal. By choosing betrayal, they symbolically declare, "I will not confront myself," foreclosing the possibility of individuation and ensuring perpetual psychic immaturity. Betrayal initiates a cascade of predictable internal consequences. With the final relational mirror removed, the narcissist's ego is left without support, destabilizing the balance between persona, ego, and shadow. Libido collapse follows as psychic energy, previously outsourced and stabilized by another, now evaporates. Motivation becomes brittle, short-lived, and dependent entirely on novelty, attention, or superficial external sources. Jung likened this state to a wasteland, activity without fertility, movement without direction. Over time, this inner deadness manifests as chronic boredom, irritability, and dissatisfaction. Outward success may continue, but it masks a psyche gradually hollowed by its refusal to confront internal truth. Material gains cannot compensate for the erosion of meaning, creativity, and authentic psychic vitality. The narcissist's internal collapse is subtle yet relentless. Empathy diminishes, curiosity disappears, and creativity dries up, leaving existence mechanical rather than lived. Jung emphasized that life without connection to the self becomes purely performative. They may socialize, work, or even appear thriving, yet internally the psyche erodes unnoticed. This slow erosion, catalyzed by betrayal, is irreversible because it is structural rather than circumstantial. Your absence is irrelevant to this process. It occurs because the narcissist's inner architecture has been fatally destabilized. Betrayal severs the final conduit of psychic energy, triggering a shadow backlash that cannot be metabolized. Every subsequent attempt to seek validation, control, or admiration becomes increasingly desperate, increasingly hollow. The shadow backlash intensifies over time because the narcissist has no remaining container for projections. All shame, envy, rage, and inferiority that were once directed outward now return with force. Jung warned that the psyche clings to illusions rather than face unbearable truths. In the narcissist, this manifests as a compulsion to rewrite narratives. You were weak, ungrateful, or obsessed. These stories are protective. They prevent acknowledgement of the truth. Betrayal hollowed them out rather than empowered them. Guilt, which could have catalyzed reflection or integration, instead festers in the shadow, transforming into resentment, cynicism, and contempt. Over decades, this poison seeps into relationships, erodes intimacy, and flattens joy, creating a feedback loop of psychic deterioration invisible to outsiders. The consequences extend into the second half of life. Jung observed that adulthood demands inward development. Those who resist this process suffer neurosis of meaninglessness. Betrayal ensures that the narcissist enters this phase without internal resources. Status, wealth, or influence cannot compensate for the absence of a structured inner life. The shadow grows heavier while the ego weakens, creating a compounding feedback loop of bitterness and decline. Psychic collapse does not require conscious awareness. The narcissist does not need to consciously miss you or lament the loss. Structural consequences are autonomous. The psyche hardens, repeats, and narrows, ultimately entrapping them in a trajectory that is self-perpetuating, inevitable, and invisible to both the narcissist and those observing externally. From a behavioral perspective, the narcissist maintains appearances while internally disintegrating. Persona inflation temporarily masks the void, giving the illusion of competence, vitality, or mastery. But when the persona becomes the sole organizing principle of the psyche, it turns tyrannical, dictating perception, action, and interaction. Every subsequent relationship becomes a repetition compulsion, idealization, extraction, devaluation, and replacement. Jung emphasized that repetition is driven by unresolved complexes rather than conscious choice. The narcissist may believe they are choosing different people, circumstances, or opportunities, yet internally, the same unresolved shadow patterns dictate behavior. Emotional range narrows, tolerance diminishes, and flexibility erodes, leaving a brittle, reactive psyche dependent entirely on external mirrors. Ultimately, the narcissist's failure to recover is structural, not circumstantial. Betrayal was not merely a miscalculated act. It was the pivotal event that ensured permanent psychological stagnation. By destroying the relational mirror that might have catalyzed shadow integration, they triggered shadow autonomy and libido collapse. Recovery requires reflection, guilt tolerance, and the ability to integrate unconscious material, capacities the narcissist fundamentally lacks. Jung warned that when psychic lessons are refused, life returns them as fate. Every subsequent attempt to reconstruct the self externally is doomed to failure, because the internal structure, the integration of ego, persona, and shadow, has been irreversibly compromised. Their life continues, but inner evolution has stopped, quietly and permanently. Jung described persona inflation as a condition in which the ego identifies entirely with the mask, losing access to inner truth and connecting only with performance. After betrayal, the narcissist doubles down on this identification. The mask becomes thicker, more intricate, and more heavily defended. This overinvestment comes at the cost of internal development. Psychic energy that could have nourished self-reflection and integration is consumed entirely by image maintenance. Every relationship becomes a stage, every person an audience, and life itself a series of increasingly hollow performances. Jung emphasized that the psyche requires balance. When inward life is neglected, symptoms arise. In the narcissist, these present as boredom, restlessness, or dissatisfaction, signaling profound psychic starvation rather than mere caprice or moral failing. Deprojection is painful, precisely because it forces the ego to assume responsibility for qualities once projected onto another. Power, validation, certainty, and meaning return in raw form, unintegrated, challenging the psyche to reclaim its authority. Jung warned that this is inherently uncomfortable, yet necessary for growth. Where the narcissist flees from this task, you endure it, building internal solidity. As you engage with the shadow, unacknowledged needs, suppressed boundaries, latent assertiveness, and unrecognized self-worth, you transform raw material into psychic energy. Betrayal exposes patterns of overgiving, tolerance of distortion, and deference to external realities, not as judgment but as data. The shadow, when consciously integrated, becomes vitality. Confronted without self-contempt, it consolidates ego strength, producing solidity rather than fragmentation. In the final analysis, the difference between you and the narcissist is stark and defining. They chose repetition, projection, and avoidance. You chose confrontation, integration, and transformation. One path leads to psychic calcification, the other to individuation. The divergence is irrevocable. You reclaimed your energy, your coherence, and yourself. The narcissist remains a monument to avoidance, repeating cycles of emptiness, unaware that their attempts to destabilize you catalyzed your liberation instead. In Jungian terms, this is everything. Betrayal did not weaken you, it returned you to yourself, and that difference determines the trajectory of a life.